This video is very nerdy and demanding, I'm warning you right now. It's also more tentative than almost all the videos I make. I try to give mature judgments in my videos, but here I'm going to give some strong reactions to Burgon, but also plead for a little grace as I work to make sure I'm understanding him well. So I'm welcoming corrections in a way I usually don't from those who know Burgon better than I do. So let's get into it. Dean Burgon, author of the still-touted book, The Revision Revised, is in my mind the original King James Onlyist. His opinions don't line up neatly with the movement in its current forms, but he was the first critic out of the gate when the English Revised Version was published in 1881. And he set the tone that is still found in countless YouTube videos and chick tracks today that defend the King James Version. I've never encountered a King James defender with anything approaching Burgon's eloquence, except I'd say Theodore Letus, but the Burgon tone is unmistakable. I believe it's under Crown copyright in Britain to this day. Too bad they don't enforce that copyright in America. That would save me a lot of trouble. And what a tone! I've never been so exhausted by a book as I was by Revision Revised. Indeed, I admit I had to resort to some skimming when the details and the disgruntlement both got too thick. Burgon is in constant DEFCON 1 status over the text critical work of the committee who produced the English Revised Version. He drops it to DEFCON 2 status over their translation work, but still reading his book is like listening to a blaring alarm for 8 hours and then moving that alarm 25 yards away, but listening to it for another 4. If I'm ever captured by Ruckmanite forces and taken to a basement cell for torture and interrogation, all they'll have to do is tie my hands behind my back and play the Revision Revised audiobook version on loudspeakers, and I'll be forced to capitulate to their demands. I'll have to use the King James Version exclusively forever, even in heaven. And if they use an AI-generated computer amalgam of Peter Ruckman's voice for that audiobook, I won't be able to make it 2 lines. I'll have to appear on my YouTube channel, take all of my 50 false friends back, and read a statement that they prepared positing that God knew, I speak as a fool, what study and halt and so that would come to me in our day, and he inspired the King James translators to use them in what are our now current meanings. Back to Burgon, and back to his tone. I'm going to offer something of an explanation for his tone toward the end, something I just learned from Maurice Robinson, who will soon be on the channel, but I still have to critique that tone. Dean Burgon can't just disagree with the overall approach to New Testament textual criticism that, he couldn't know, now sort of reigns almost 150 years later. We aren't doing exactly what Westcott and Hort did, but we're still basing our work on some of theirs. He had to prove to everyone that what we now call the critical text is vastly more remote from the inspired autographs of the evangelists, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, than any which has appeared since the invention of printing. Burgon can't just list places where his judgments on textual matters might differ from those of the scholars who put together the ERV, and Burgon was clearly a very well-educated man who was, to borrow a phrase from Scrivener, capable of forming an intelligent judgment on critical subjects. He has to call their resulting text, however, seriously mutilated and otherwise grossly depraved. Burgon can't just lament that in a number of minor particulars, Bible readers might now be, in his judgment, somewhat misled. He has to speak of, quote, the deadly mischief which the revisers have effected. Burgon can't just offer a few editorial comments on inelegant renderings in the ERV. He has to blame the revisers for the inexcusable fault of having only a slender acquaintance with the resources and proprieties of English speech. Ouch. He likes to use words like calamitous to describe his opponent's decisions. He says they have a grievous lack of taste, not to say of scholarship. Double ouch. He dismisses his opponent's views as utterly absurd. He concludes, quote, we lay the revisers' volume down convinced that the case of their work is simply hopeless. They had a noble version before them, namely the King James, which they have contrived to spoil in every part. I can't actually call the whole book invective. Burgon's work is too erudite for me to dismiss it with such a word, even though he felt no such compunction when evaluating the work of the scholars behind the ERV. Again, Burgon had considerable critical faculties. I was impressed with his prose style, with his appeals to multiple ancient languages, and with his command of very obscure text critical data. I think the word that I'd use to describe his book is not invective, but avalanche. It would take many years of education in multiple languages and many, many hours of painstaking work to weigh every last one of Burgon's charges. I've done the former. I'm unwilling at this point to do the latter, at least at this moment, both because the ERV is no longer used by anyone I know of, and because in the many places where I was already up to speed on the issues that Burgon was raising, he didn't give me good reason to trust his judgments. Repeatedly, in fact, he gave me the opposite. In something as complex as textual criticism and translation, I just don't trust people who have nothing positive to say about the work of others. Burgon probably gives something like a full 1,000 examples in his book. And in every single one that I read, he is obviously right, and his opponents are horrific, ham-handed dolts. He says in one place of Westcott and Hort, "The tissue which these accomplished scholars have been 30 years in elaborating proves on inspection to be as flimsy and as worthless as any spider's web." I'll give just one example of Burgon's failed judgment, and I know this is far, far from enough. And it's not that all of his judgments were flawed. I did agree at some points. But this is representative of the feeling that I had just about whenever he brought up issues with which I was already familiar. Late in the book, in the comparatively smaller section focused on translation and not text, Burgon rattled off in one paragraph 16 examples of phrases which, he said, must not be deemed improvements over the corresponding renderings in the King James. He made the same argument about them that modern King James onlyists do. Are these really supposed to be less obscure than the passages they are intended to supersede? It just so happens, though, that I just wrote and shot a whole video on one of his examples, namely Philippians 2:6, and the famous phrase describing Jesus, "Thought it not robbery to be equal with God." What Burgon tossed off in a dismissive line with no specific comment, I just spent a couple hours working through the day before that I actually read this part of Revision Revised. And the matter just isn't as simple as Burgon tries to make it. I conclude that, like nearly all his heirs today, Burgon doesn't seem willing to acknowledge that sometimes translation presents toss-ups. The fact is that the rendering in the ERV, prize, is perfectly defensible, more defensible than the odd word robbery, chosen by Jerome and maintained by Tyndale and ultimately left to stand in the King James Version by their translators. I happen to think that both robbery and prize are defensible choices, but Burgon never thinks this, not that I could see. He never sees it as 6 of one, half dozen of the other. He never even sees a textual or translational choice as 5 of one and 7 of another. It sure felt like it was always the whole baker's dozen versus no bagels at all in the other box. In fact, I couldn't find any place in the book where Burgon acknowledged that the ERV translators might have a good point to make. Admittedly, again, I did do some skimming, and those inclined to doubt me will say that I must have missed that part. Perhaps so. If anyone can find such a place, I will gladly acknowledge it in the comments. Recently, a YouTube commenter expressed amazement that I could call King James onlyists to meet me halfway. How can we meet error halfway, he said. And I get that. I'm not going to go half egalitarian or half LGBTQ affirming or even half Pepsi and half Coke. Some issues do call for a bright and clear line. But the actual questions of translation and textual criticism faced by actual Christian scholars who are actually tasked with putting together an actual Bible translation for actual churches and actual readers are not matters of clear perfection versus clear heresy. They have to do with whether we should translate an obscure idiom literally or according to its contemporary meaning. They have to do with whether the word order in a specific verse seems likely to grant emphasis to one particular word or not, and whether and how that might be reflected in translation. They have to do with the spelling of long-dead proper names. They have to do with whether historical presence in Mark should be translated as past tense or present tense English verbs. They have to do with a kabillion minute judgments punctuated with 1,000 moderate-sized ones. They have to do with weighing competing but genuine values. Every good translator of anything knows this. The King James translators themselves show over and over that they understood this. They show it in their preface, which is very balanced and judicious in its acknowledgement of the difficulties inherent in Bible translation. And they show it in their actual work. To give just one example, they translate some historical presence as present and some as pasts. They were not slavishly dedicated to any kind of literalism. Burgon seems to defend his tone toward the beginning of the book. "Delay would have been fatal," he said. "I saw plainly that unless a sharp blow was delivered immediately, the citadel would be in the enemy's hands." So he spent June, July, August, and September of 1881 putting together this book. 1,000 judgments in 4 months, let's say. That is admittedly a very rough estimate. Here's another very rough estimate. Burgon made approximately 250 judgments a month for 120 feverish days. And I dispute that this was necessary or wise. By deciding to give no quarter and by going DEFCON 1 and 2, he lost all people who know how scholarly judgments actually work. And he riled up a ton of people who don't. They're still riled up to this day. Burgon, it seems to me, did a lot more tearing down than building. I won't say that that in itself is wrong. I'm critiquing Burgon pretty heavily, but then I also don't see how his own text critical principles, as stated in his book, would suffice for the work of New Testament textual criticism today. I admit that I have more reading to do on this topic. This is one place I'm tentative, but I'll explain what I'm thinking currently based on this one book. Burgon says that these are his principles. An appeal shall be unreservedly made to Catholic antiquity, and the combined verdict of manuscripts, versions, fathers shall be regarded as decisive. Burgon writes, whenever I would judge of the authenticity of any particular reading, I insist on bringing it to the test of Catholic antiquity. If that witness is consentient, or that is, they consent, or very nearly so, whether for or against any given reading, I hold it to be decisive. To no other system of arbitration will I submit myself. I decline to recognize any other criterion of truth. Burgon specifically denies that he has made the received text his standard. He says that it is, quote, quite good enough for all ordinary purposes, and yet, he says, so far am I from pinning my faith to it, that is the TR, that I eagerly make my appeal from it to, by contrast, the threefold witnesses of copies, versions, fathers, whenever I find its testimony challenged. In other words, when Burgon encounters differences among manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, he looks to age, geographical spread, and multiple testimonies. That's what Catholic antiquity means, or I take it to mean. To be more specific, he looks to the manuscripts that have survived the centuries. He looks to the ancient Bible translations like the Peshitta, the Coptic, the Vulgate, and the Ge'ez, and he looks to the Fathers. That's where he's done actually a lot of valuable work, I'm told. Is that legitimate? Well, contemporary critics do all the same things, but what if their combined verdict is not clear? What if it's a hung jury? What if there are three major options? That happens. I don't feel that I got a clear answer on this question from Burgon's book, but I could have missed it. And I confess that I have not yet read enough Burgon to give a clearer answer as to his views, so I'll just assume I'm not getting the full picture of his views on how positively to do textual criticism. I will note instead a place or two where Burgon is out of step with his modern heirs. He shows that he does not consider the Textus Receptus itself to be infallible. Rather, quote, the best supported reading must always be held to be the true reading, and nothing may be rejected from the commonly received text except on evidence which shall clearly outweigh the evidence for retaining it. That's not what modern King James defenders say. They consistently say that the TR is perfect. Burgon says, in not a few particulars, the Textus Receptus does call for revision, certainly, although revision on entirely different principles from those which are found to have prevailed in the Jerusalem chamber, in other words, among the committee who produced the English Revised Version of 1881. Burgon puts his guineas where his gob is, look it up, however, and he actually does name one place, at least, where he'd alter the Textus Receptus. He says, when our Lord first sent forth his 12 apostles, it was certainly no part of his ministerial commission to them to raise the dead. That's necrus egerite, Matthew 10:8. This is easily demonstrable, Burgon says. He doesn't say why this is easily demonstrable. I checked the apparatus of the NA28, and he's citing with a few ancient versions, as he said he would, the Sahidic Coptic, the Syriac Peshitta, the Middle Egyptian, but he's also citing against others, as it happens, the Latin Vulgate and certain older Latin translations, other Syriac translations, and the Bohairic Coptic. In fact, the principle of Catholic antiquity simply does not seem to work here. And yet Burgon sees his viewpoint as easily demonstrable, and he turns right to attacking the English revisers for retaining the phrase. Quote, yet is the spurious clause retained by our revisionists, because it is found in those corrupt witnesses, Aleph, B, C, and D, and the Latin copies. Now, I've paid attention to the King James TR debate for many years. I've listened to and read all the major and countless minor figures promoting this basic viewpoint, though I haven't read every last thing that every one of them has written. But I have listened to IFB King James Onlyists and Calvinistic King James defenders. I can't remember a single time any one of them has disagreed with the TR as represented in the King James. Maybe Letus did it, but I always found him so hard to pin down. How do the King James only schools who assign Burgon's work, I saw this in a syllabus recently, how do they deal with this? He seems to have a pretty cavalier willingness to depart from the TR. I don't know. There is at least one other place where I think Burgon is out of step with most modern King James defenders, and that's in his willingness to acknowledge that perfectly literal translations are impossible. He notes, for example, that the Greek word teknon means child in all but one of the multiple places that it's used in the New Testament. And he says it just simply cannot mean child in that place, and he's right. I don't hear that from many modern King James and TR defenders. What I do tend to hear from them is that translations have to be literal to be accurate, that if the Greek has an article, so should the English. Burgon did not think this. To rejoin, as if it were a sufficient answer, that the definite article is found in all these places in the original Greek is preposterous. In French also we say télès la vie. I guess that's like the origin of la vie. But in translating from the French, we do not therefore say such is the life. Burgon is right, as were the King James translators, who most certainly did not always translate articles, and who specifically decried the idea that all translations should be as literal as possible. Contemporary mainstream King James-only leaders have maintained Burgon's DEFCON 1 alarm bells, but without a modicum of the critical abilities that he possessed. He was a man of a different world. He could write well in the 19th century style, and he really did know his stuff, even if I'm questioning his judgment. One thing I couldn't quite understand was the soft spot that Burgon had in his heart for F.H.A. Scrivener, one of the members of the English Revised Version team. He wrote, "As for prebendary Scrivener, the only really competent textual critic of the whole party, it is well known that he found himself perpetually outvoted by 2/3 of those present, that is, on the English Revised Version Committee. We look forward to the forthcoming new edition of his plain introduction in the confident belief that he will there make it abundantly plain that he is in no degree responsible for the monstrous text which it became his painful duty to conduct through the press on behalf of the entire body, of which he continued to the last to be a member. It is no secret, this is Burgon still, that throughout Dr. Scrivener pleaded in vain for the general view we have ourselves advocated in this and the preceding article." Now, I've read a goodly bit of F.H.A. Scrivener's writings, more so than of Burgon, and though Burgon claims Scrivener for his viewpoint, I'm just not seeing it. To me, Scrivener sounds a great deal more like Westcott and Hort than he does like Burgon. For more on this, see my lecture on Henry Ambrose here on this exciting YouTube channel. But let me say this much here. You will never see King James and TR defenders today diving into text-critical details the way Scrivener did in his plain introduction to the criticism of the New Testament, or even the way Burgon did at such great length with so many examples in Revision Revised. Today's King James defenders just don't think they need to do that kind of work. They believe they have a perfect Greek text. But Scrivener did not think this way, and really neither did Burgon. So even when Scrivener sides against Westcott and Hort, and with Burgon, with the Textus Receptus, he uses numbers of their principles to do this. Again, see my Henry Ambrose lecture. For example, Scrivener sides with the TR and against the critical text in John 1:18 with the phrase only begotten Son versus only begotten God. But Scrivener sees the latter reading, only begotten God, as stretching past the limits of the keep the harder reading principle, rather than as invalidation of that principle. He says that he would, in this case, stick with ancient authorities if they were united, but they aren't. This is just not the way any major modern King James and TR defender reasons. These defenders don't weigh text-critical principles against each other. They weigh the King James Version versus everything else, and they proclaim mene, tekel, upharsin to anything that doesn't fit with the King James. And very importantly to me, you just won't hear Scrivener using the tone of Burgon, even when he disagrees with Westcott and Hort. I just couldn't find DEFCON 1 or even DEFCON 2 in Scrivener. His feelings poke through often enough. He's a believer, not a computer. But overall, he's a model Christian scholar, very measured. He's openly respectful toward Westcott and Hort in a way that Burgon certainly was not. Scrivener calls Westcott and Hort's introduction to their Greek New Testament, quote, an important and comprehensive work, the joint labor of two of the best scholars of this age. Might it possibly blow the minds of not a few King James defenders to know that the man who put together the very edition of the Textus Receptus that they say is perfect called Westcott and Hort two of the best scholars of this age? Scrivener shortly goes on to disagree with Westcott and Hort on some fundamental matters, but not the fundamental matters Burgon and today's King James and TR defenders would choose. If I had to sum up what I see in F.H.A. Scrivener, I'd say this. He uses the same basic principles as Westcott and Hort, but makes a different judgment as to the weight that Sinaiticus and Vaticanus ought to bear in textual criticism. I'd like some opportunity to revise that judgment over time. That's one of the things I'm saying that's a bit tentative today. YouTube is a demanding medium. I gotta put out stuff fast or the algorithm will take me to a basement interrogation room and force me to use the King James exclusively forever. So I'd like to plead again for a bit more time, possibly even a few years, to read enough Scrivener to feel like I fully understand the relationship of his ideas to those of Westcott and Hort. But I've put hours and hours into reading Revision Revised, and if you think I'm wrong, I think you'll have to do hours and hours and hours to offer an alternative viewpoint. I really do invite you to do so. I'm certain there's more for me to learn here. I, again, am offering some of these reflections tentatively. When it comes to the fundamental disjunction, however, that I and my Textual Confidence Collective are trying to argue for, I don't know precisely where to put Burgon at this point. Was he a textual absolutist, or did he take a textual confidence view? He did allow for errors in the TR, but still, I did some searching in my large Logos library for other assessments of Burgon, going back over a century. And I will say, tentatively, that Bible scholars that I read, especially B.B. Warfield, seem to see what I see in Burgon, and what I see in today's King James and TR defenders. That Burgon talked a ton like a textual absolutist, with occasional nods to the reality that we don't have an absolutely perfect form of the text. Burgon, they said, argued vehemently for the idea that providence guides us to the traditional text. This is still the pattern today. I'm saying this tentatively. I'm hoping to take more time to establish whether I'm being fair to Burgon or not. Let me end with this. I discovered via Byzantine prioritist Maurice Robinson just this past week while filming an episode for this channel with him and Tim Burgo. This is going to be good. Robinson told me one big reason why Burgon's Revision Revised has a tone that one 19th century writer called incessant and violent. Namely this: Burgon's book was originally written anonymously in a series of essays, and the quarterly review in which it appeared was known for this kind of tone. This is what you do when you're anonymous, same like Twitter trolls today. Or this is what Robinson told me, and I did find evidence of this to back it up as well. This makes a great deal of sense. It does let Burgon off of some of the hook for how divisive his tone is, but not entirely off the hook. It's still clinging to a bit of his flesh, because when his identity became known, he allowed the essays he'd written to be collected and then published in his name, apparently as best I can tell. And his tone has had a negative impact over the last century and a half. Burgon's work is assigned reading in every variety of IFB and Calvinistic King James defense that I've come across. I come away from his work with a very, very negative taste in my mouth, though genuine respect for his skill in so many ways and his knowledge. I also come away with the feeling I saw validated by B.B. Warfield in an essay from around the turn of the century. It felt to me as if Burgon didn't give a full accounting of his text-critical principles, positively speaking, for his viewpoint. I really do just have to wonder if all the King James defenders who are promoting his work still, because of his entertainingly violent critiques and obviously intelligent critiques against Westcott and Hort, I just have to wonder if all of them really understand what Burgon was arguing for.